Okay, so now that we have our cart as well as our ability to display cart items, we want to tackle something like displaying the number of items we have in our cart inside of our cart icon, because right now it just displays 0. Well, thinking about what we know already about pulling Redux state into local components, maybe we'd do something where we would write a map state to props, where we would pull the state in and then get the value. Now, what would this look like? Well, we would write our map state to props value. And here we would get our state, where we would destructure off cart, and from cart, we'd pull off the cart items. And maybe we'd pass in a value of item count, which is equal to accumulating the quantity on each of our cart items. Now, if we were to look at our code of what our state looks like, and let's look at the items themselves. We know that the quantity value is a number, and we want to add them all together to get the total number of items we have. Well, this is a good time to use our reduce function, if we remember, where we want to bring it down to one final value. So what we could call is something like cart items.reduce, where we would pass in 0 as the initial accumulator value, because if you remember, we want to add all of the values in our quantity. So we would get our accumulated quantity as the first argument in our first function, and then we would get the actual cart item as the second argument. And what we would return is accumulated quantity plus cart item dot quantity. And what this will do for us is it will accumulate all the number values of the quantities on all the cart items. Now, if you remember from our reducer lesson, how we added up those values together, this is doing the exact same thing, but using our quantity value. So if we can imagine we had 3 cart items and the quantities were 1, 2, 3 respectively, well, the first time our reducer code gets called, it will add 0 and 1, giving us 1, then 1 plus 2, giving us 3, then 3 plus 3, giving us 6, and we would end up with an item count of 6. So what this will do then is pass that 6 in as our item count parameter, which we would then pass in as a prop to our component. So we then destructure it off of our props and pass it in place of 0. And now if we save and we look at our app, we'll see that our count goes up for every item that we add. And we'll see that it matches. We have 2, 2, and 1, which gives us 5 total quantity of items. Now, what we've written just now is called a selector, because what we're doing here is we are writing some kind of code that gets a state, as in the whole state object, and then pulls off just a small portion or a slice of that state. Because what we're getting is we're getting the cart, then the cart items, and then reducing over those cart items to get a new value. We're computing out a new value based off of the state. Now, the caveat to this, even though this is how Redux suggests the code to be written, is that we'll notice that whenever any reducer updates, when we remember looking at our reducer code, we're always returning a new object. Now, whenever we return a new object and Redux recomposes and rebuilds the entire state object, map state to props is actually getting called every single time, which is always passing in new props to our components. And why this is important is because this is always re-rendering our components. Now, I can actually show you how this will happen. Let's say, for example, we console log whenever map state to props gets called. And I'll say, I am being called. So even though our cart icon component only cares about cart items, what ends up happening is whenever we change the state, so let's say, for example, we're not modifying our cart state, let alone our cart item state, we're modifying our current user on our user state. If I sign in right now, you'll see that I am being called gets triggered because the map state to props inside of our cart icon component is still being called. And then if I sign out, right, again, it's just current user getting changed. But again, our console log is still firing, which means that our map state to props keeps firing. And this is important because our reduce is always returning a new value, because reduce doesn't know that the cart items coming in might be the exact same. So let's say we had 2 items in our cart and it reduces down to the value of 2. If these cart items come in again, but it's the exact same 2 items, reduce is still getting called. So we're still always getting a new computed value. And you might be thinking, why would that happen if the objects are the same? Well, they're actually not, because our state is always a new object, which means that everything, even if the value is identical, the object of our total state is a brand new object, which means everything inside of it, all of the data inside of it, is brand new. And that's why every time reduce gets called, whatever those cart items will also be brand new, even if the value is the same 2 cart items. Now, this is not good for performance because we don't want to re-render our component every time the state changes, especially if those state changes don't actually modify the parts of the state that our component cares about. So what we would want to do is to be able to store or cache the value of what our selector is using to compute its value. So if the cart item values don't actually change, right, and if the output of the selector doesn't change, we don't want to re-render our component. Well, what this is actually called is memoization, which is the caching of the selector's value. And we can actually achieve this kind of memoization using a library called reselect. And reselect allows us to write these selectors in such a way so that it knows that if the properties that it's pulling from the state and using are the same in the sense that their value hasn't changed and the output of the selector is not different, then it won't actually pass them into our component. It'll just pass the old value, and our React component will know not to re-render. There's also other benefits in the sense that it allows us to actually separate our selectors and make them reusable. Now let's actually take a look at how to do this.